Well, good evening and welcome. My name is Jeff Schaefer. I'm the director of the Hale Institute here at NSA. We're pleased to have you here with us this evening for this lecture from Dr. Glenn Moots, who I will introduce here in a moment, and then who will himself, I'm told, introduce us to a history that may seem ancient but is in fact quite and vitally current. But before that introduction, a few observations of my own. In considering the contemporary cultural and political milieu, our descriptions of it now seem to emerge from us almost viscerally, as we commonly offer labels for its character in terms like decay, dissolution, bleakness, chaos, incoherence, disorder, rootlessness, unwinding. The import and the goals of our presiding late modern philosophy are revealing themselves in increasing clarity in their inhuman deformity and viciousness. It would be redundant for me, I think, to recite the proliferating social ills that now stagger the mind. We know, though, that innocence is available to the young only if they have guardians postured in constant martial vigilance. The proverbial phrase, those who call evil good and good evil, who take darkness for light and light for darkness, or every man did what was right in his own eyes, are no longer taken as declarations of woe, but as templates for how best to understand and describe human freedom. And persons' attainment of such opportunities for inversion is now understood as a principal purpose of state power. Now, I say these things not that we persist in lament, but to mention that our circumstance presents us an invitation and an opportunity for a long overdue reassessment of the foundations of social order, along with the consideration of whether the divinely governed and sustained nature of the cosmos might have some relevance to how we structure political society. For the fact of the matter is that we are now, I dare say, daily, being mercifully disabused of the misconception that the so-called secular order is benign and neutral. It is rather a diabolical death work. It has been a creedal aspect of contemporary public reason that the Christian faith must be subordinated to the requirements of the secular reason and scientific materialism that have asserted sovereignty over all public categories. Now, of course, this weak read of public reason has obscured its vulnerability. It has proceeded in parasitic reliance on the continuing private religious subscriptions of citizens under its sway in order to maintain an adequate moral and motivational substructure for community faith in law and the fundamental principles of social organization. This is something like the later life acknowledgement by Jürgen Habermas of the theoretical inadequacy of the solitary secular vision. But Habermas' solution to that problem cedes no public ground to the theological. He instead suggests encouraging religion's private flourishing as an instrumental supplement to the secular public project. Religionists are unlikely to miss the irony of Habermas inviting their contributions to rescue the very system that mandates their continuing marginalization. Christianity presents the revelation of He who created, comprehends, and defines the totality of existence. And as a result, it can only be proper that the political realm is shaped in and deferring to Christian wisdom. As a friend has put it, it belongs to the nature of Christianity to be established in the real world and officially recognized by the institutions that constitute and order the political community. Now, I'm glad for the recent ascendance of discussions in earnest on this point. I would just register one observation toward the conversation. To employ the law's levers in order to introduce a Christian influence upon its exercises, while I certainly welcome that sort of improvement for reasons stated, it's not sufficient to the day, nor is the day ready for it, to understate the point a bit. Instead, in coming to grips with our cultural condition of everywhere instantiated unbelief, a response suited to it will require first a radical understanding of our epochal deviance in mind and in practice, and an equally radical turning away from it. That is a prostrating metanoia, not an instrumental step in service of a political program, but a deep repentance as a necessity before God, and thus of value only insofar as it is not pursued instrumentally. Now, Glenn may dispute all of this that I'm setting forward here. I don't know, that's his prerogative, and he's about to get both the microphone as well as the last word. But I offer these thoughts by way of introduction and explanation for my invitation to get him here with us. As a historian, he has spent decades in conversation, so to speak, with our Christian forebears who were writing hundreds of years ago, and those persons in turn wrote in engagement with their predecessors, many of whom were equally or more distant in time. And it does us well to hear of how they conceived of questions and answers on the connections between the political and the theological, and also to hear of the contexts, the soil, so to speak, in which such ideas could viably take root. So our speaker this evening is Dr. Glenn Moots. He earned his BA in Political Science and Asian Studies from the University of Michigan, where he also met his wife of almost 30 years. They have 2 children, now recently married. He earned his PhD and MA in Political Science and an MA in Philosophy at Louisiana State University. He also holds an MS in Finance from Walsh College. He is author of Politics Reformed, the Anglo-American Legacy of Covenant Theology, for which publication of an audiobook and a Portuguese translation is now in progress. He is co-editor of and contributor to Justifying Revolution, Law, Virtue, and Violence in the American War of Independence. He is also author of 100 occasional essays, book chapters, book reviews, or refereed journal articles. He also has been a fellow at both Princeton University and the Huntington Library. After he speaks, we'll have the opportunity to present our questions to him, so have that in mind as you're listening. But for the moment, please warmly welcome Dr. Glenn Moots.
Like everything Jeff said, I was going to give him another 10 minutes. I appreciate that. Jeff, I appreciate your thoughts, and I appreciate you having me here. Kind of feel like I'm in the promised land. I've been paying attention to New St. Andrews and the classical school revival and all those good things for many years. Doug was nice enough to plug my book 9 years ago. He called it The Butterfly's Boots. So I got a little boost from that, for which I'm thankful. Normally, I'm in Michigan. I'm on sabbatical. I came in from California. And as I was working through this, I said to my wife, you know, honey, I've been teaching almost as long as we've been married, and maybe I should change it up a little bit, 30 years. And she said, oh, honey, don't try to be too charming. Just be yourself. The older people in the room will recognize if I do this, right? Okay. I'm going to start with a kind of a detective story. And it's not really a true crime podcast or anything like that, but we're going to try to solve a mystery. And we're going to start in 1683 in New England, when an important man who was buried with martial honors was buried, died in 1683, buried in 1683. He was buried with martial honors, like I said, but he was not a soldier. If anything, he prevented war between the settlers and the American Indians. In 1771, a committee was formed to draw up plans to honor the man, but first they had to determine where he was buried. According to one account, the revolution intervened and the committee didn't get that far. Now, if you do the math from 1775 to 1771, you might be thinking, well, that committee moves slower than any committee I'm on. And that is a bit of a mystery, although in this colony in 1772, the colonists did perpetrate one of the most pivotal and destructive acts prior to the war, when they burned a British customs enforcement vessel. And the ringleader of that act, Abraham Whipple, foreshadowed the American aptitude for Twitter when a British officer in 112 characters told Whipple that he would hang him at the yardarm, to which Whipple replied in only 43 characters, "Sir, always catch a man before you hang him." Well, no one in this relatively small town and a relatively small colony could recall where the man was buried, and so it fell to an anonymous letter sent to the local newspaper 50 years later to recount events in which supposedly the man's casket had been found by accident, then corroborated by a man in his 80s or 90s. Those stories were then assisted by the granddaughter of a man who said that when he was 10 years old, he was lowered into this famous man's grave by his father, who hoped it would make an impression. Pretty good for Halloween, too, right? So that story was then corroborated by a contemporary descendant who said, oh yeah, even though the ground had been leveled out, I think we know where that is, because there used to be a boy that rolled boulders down the hill and he hit one of the headstones, and so we used to kind of mark it off, from this headstone. Now, a specialist in the funerary habits of early America might tell us that none of this is unique, that it might take 2 centuries using fairly sketchy evidence to locate the grave of a person buried in the late 17th century. But the burial plot is not the mystery. The mystery is how this man was essentially forgotten and commemorated only a full 2 centuries after his death. That's when the monuments went up. And this is a mystery because he was no ordinary person. By all accounts, he was quite an extraordinary person. He was so extraordinary that he has merited an incredible amount of attention, including at least a dozen full-length biographies, dedicated articles, sentimental poems, children's biographies. This is actually a small publishing industry that was launched in the 19th century. Most of it was composed a full 2 centuries after the man's death and ramped up considerably in the 20th century. And the most recent study of this man was just published in 2019. Now, has anybody figured out who I'm talking about? No. This is Roger Williams. Who's heard of Roger Williams? Yeah. So in 2012, best-selling author John Barry wrote yet another biography of Roger Williams. Now, it's interesting that no one's figured out that this is Roger Williams, although when I say, have you heard of him, you say yes. This sort of justifies probably writing another book about Roger Williams, so I'm going to make a note. This will sell. Barry wrote this book in 2012. It won the LA Times Book Award, Book of the Year. Some New England Historical Society gave him an award. That's not unusual because Barry's a good author and he's popular, but here's what he says about Williams. He shaped the nature of religion, political power, and individual rights in America. And that kind of hyperbole and hagiography is even reflected in the title. In the title, Barry says that Williams created the American soul and birthed liberty. How about that? Busy guy. This is a guy I remember that nobody thought about for 2 centuries. Would you like to be that influential from the grave? This claim, as Barry surely knows, is nonsense, because after all, how is it that a man who created both the American soul and birthed American liberty went uncommemorated for almost 2 centuries after his death, even at the time of the Revolution? But in delving deeper into the mystery, we find that the rehabilitation of Roger Williams is really the story of the rehabilitation of a particular kind of Protestantism. There should be no question that Roger Williams is one of the most interesting people in American history. I'll concede that in a moment. And one can easily appreciate how elements of his life contempt many books. He was a Puritan minister who came to Massachusetts Bay. He was earlier an assistant to Sir Edward Coke. He invented a mysterious shorthand that was only recently decoded. He gave the first account of the Narragansett language in English, used his genuine interest in his neighbors, his Indian neighbors, to establish good relations with them. and settled Providence and co-settled Rhode Island after surviving exile from Massachusetts Bay. That's quite a life. Our main interest in Williams is as an opponent of religious establishment, however. Williams, like many evangelicals today, believed that the state should take no role in furthering the interests of any church. Williams expressed these ideas most famously in a book entitled The Bloody Tenet of Persecution, a book preceded by a lengthy scolding of his Puritan colleague and polemical opponent John Cotton, who responded in kind. When Williams published The Bloody Tenet, Cotton published a response titled The Bloody Tenet washed and made white in the blood of the Lamb, to which Williams replied, the bloody tenet made yet more bloody by John Cotton's attempt to wash it white in the blood of the Lamb. The exchange lasted 7 years and was published in London and read on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, I'm not going to summarize the arguments, but Williams is, I think, a good representative of arguments for disestablishment. And this is almost entirely what motivated his rehabilitation. And in that rehabilitation, we see a reversal of American thinking about what we now call church and state. Let's go back and consider what people thought about Williams and the disestablishment project. What did Rhode Island's neighbors think of Rhode Island? Did they say, thank goodness Roger Williams and his colleagues created the American soul and birthed liberty? No. Here's Pastor John Woolbridge of Connecticut writing to Richard Baxter. He said, Rhode Island is known for two things, fat mutton and liberty of conscience. Woolbridge described Rhode Island as a sink into which all the other colonies emptied their heretics. Two Dutch Reform ministers went further, describing Rhode Island as New England's latrine, where all the cranks reside thither. It was also called Rogue Island. That was a good one, too. All of this, of course, is great fun, and insofar as the main histories of New England of the era are written by Williams's opponents, this is pretty much to be expected. That's like Cotton Mather's history. It is not that interesting that Williams had enemies in the Puritan colonies, but that the supposed creator of the American soul and American liberty is ignored throughout the entire 18th century. The only exception is two short inclusions in denominational histories of the Baptists and some regional histories. And again, nobody paid any attention to Roger Williams. Nobody cared about him. He dies in obscurity. He's memorialized only by his foes, and he's essentially forgotten for about 130 years after his birth, after his death. There's a letter in which somebody writes and asks, what do we know about Roger Williams? Maybe I could write something about him. And the guy says, I don't even think we could fill 9 pages about Roger Williams. I mean, that's just how much he was really kind of ignored and unknown. And of course, my point there is that he was not influential, right? Williams is never mentioned by any of the American founders. So far as I know, none of them cites Rhode Island as a model for anything. Now, Jefferson said that William Penn, by contrast, was the greatest lawgiver in the world. Even when George Washington addresses the synagogue at Newport, Rhode Island in 1790, famous letter, if you've sort of read the greatest hits of early America, you've probably read that letter, he does extol religious liberty, but he really doesn't say anything particular about Rhode Island. He's basically extolling it as a principle for the nation in general. And I'll put one sharp point on this and move on. William McLaughlin, one of the finest histories of the region, historians of the region and a historian of colonial religion, said of Rhode Island, those who fought hardest for religious freedom in Massachusetts, Connecticut, Vermont, and New Hampshire considered Rhode Island an embarrassment rather than an asset to their cause. Nevertheless, Williams is rehabilitated beginning in the 1830s. And to cut to a chapter later in the story, I mean, I could spend a long time up here talking about the rehabilitation of Roger Williams. In a 1963 Supreme Court decision, Justice Thomas Clark, in the majority opinion in the Abington School District case, and I promised Jeff I wasn't going to get into all this con law stuff, but this is kind of funny. He says that Williams, along with Madison and Jefferson, was influential not only on the federal Constitution, but on the First Amendment, but also, and also on the constitutions of the states. It's not possible. And Perry Miller, the dean of Puritan history, New England history, said 10 years prior in 1953 that Williams had no influence. But yet somehow this finds its way to majority opinion, which winds up knocking down one more kind of establishment in the United States. Well, all this became possible because Williams was the face of a later anti-establishment strain of American Protestantism that I will talk about at some length. But first, I want to talk about the earlier establishment strain of American Protestantism that it supplanted. And insofar as American elites came to agree not only with the later strain, the anti-establishment strain, especially insofar as it paralleled their own liberalism. The otherwise obscure or scorned Williams became a perfect battering ram for beating down the door of whatever was left of Protestant establishments in America. So let's zoom out and talk about these two groups of Protestants. Now, I'm offering this not as an historically precise dichotomy, so I'm not trying to do real precise history up here. I want to make that clear. And I'm not offering these as an either-or. You may find yourself identifying with elements of both of them. And that's fine. I'm not offering this as a friend-enemy distinction. I'm not trying to do a cockfight on Twitter here, right, where we're going to go after our Baptist friends or whatever. I do that, but I don't do that publicly. So we're going to approach these with charity and humility and hopefully a little levity. I want us to return to our Protestant roots to sharpen our vision and also have some explanatory power as to why people may be taking the sides they're taking. And I readily admit that most American Protestants may actually know very little about their historical theology or ecclesiology. When I hear someone say, for example, the president of the SBC, or I'm trying to think, Andrew Walker, say that as a Baptist, I oppose establishment, I say, right on, you get it. Okay, because Baptists oppose establishment. I think he's well aware of what the Baptist tradition is that I'm going to talk about, and that makes perfect sense. When somebody, for example, in a Presbyterian denomination, which was a magisterial denomination, says, I oppose establishment, I think there's something there that doesn't make sense. Okay, so I'm going to talk about those two categories. So, and now that all the appropriate waivers are signed, let's go into the two categories. So my first category is magisterial Protestantism. So what is magisterial Protestantism and why is it magisterial? These were Protestants who thought it best to partner with the civil magistrate as they broke from Rome, and in doing so, they enabled what are called religious establishments. That cooperation enabled not only protection from Rome, but from what was feared as a chaos of a multiplicity of sects and doctrines, heresies, etc. Magisterial Protestants took a high view of civil government and believed that it could effect real good for its citizens. Now, I'll tell you a quote from Tony Campolo, who is a Baptist. Campolo said, some people thought it would be a good idea to mix church and state, but it's kind of like mixing manure and ice cream. You think it's going to make the manure better, but it just makes the ice cream worse. Now that's funny, right? That's a great rhetorical line, but obviously what is he saying? Civil government is manure. That's a low view of the magistrate. Magisterial Protestants have a high view of the magistrate. Conversely, they took a dimmer view of freedom and independence, although they carried forward the constitutional heritage, as I've written elsewhere. And in this regard, insofar as the magisterial Protestants were very constitutional, I brought this book, Althusius Politica, which is really a fine example of magisterial Protestantism, but also of political theory. And this is an excellent work of constitutionalism. To some degree, there's an overlap of constitutionalism and liberalism, I guess. That's another long conversation. So it's not as though magisterial Protestants liked big government, okay? They liked constitutional government, but they also were far from liberalism, which I think is closer to the other strain. Who were the magisterial Protestants? Both Reformed and Lutheran. I'm including Anglicans, by the way, as Reformed, which they are. It gets complicated for Congregationalists. I'll talk more about that. And you can find magisterial Protestantism in pretty much every Protestant confession, including the Scots Confession of 1560, the First and Second Helvetic, the 39 Articles, the original Westminster before it got revised. The Lutherans are less explicit on this, but were magisterial in their own way. I'm going to focus mainly on Reformed Protestants or those who were basically sects that broke away from Reformed Protestantism. Third, magisterial Protestants hope to encompass as many as possible into the fellowship, discipline, and blessing of the church through a generous distribution of the sacraments, including infant baptism. I have a friend who I really respect who's trying to construct something he calls being a magisterial Baptist. And I don't think it's going to work. And I think part of that is to say the mode or the timing of baptism does not matter, but it was instrumental for magisterial Protestantism to have infant baptism. And also the parish church model. They treated citizens as Christians, essentially. As part of a Christian polity, you're a Christian. You're a citizen, you're a Christian. There was no tell me your conversion story, as I'll talk about later. Nothing like that. They treated citizens as Christians and used civil penalties for civil disruptions and consistories or ecclesiastical courts for matters addressed in Scripture. Now that unfamiliarity, our unfamiliarity with that division can surprise us. For example, blasphemy was usually punished as a civil disruption and domestic relations fell to the church. So some establishments had consistories, okay? There was no presumption that the visible church was a gathering of saints discerned by conversion, for example, and there was certainly no such thing as believer's baptism, though there was likely some kind of catechism or confirmation. Now, if you read Althusius, he talks about catechism, and he says one of the things a magistrate has to do is establish schools, liberal arts schools, and make sure that there's catechetical instruction. Magisterial Protestantism was, generally speaking, not inclined to revivalism or other kinds of enthusiasm. Though the soteriology is what we would call Calvinistic, there was a greater emphasis on regular modes of habit, tradition, order, and culture. Don't forget the parish, right? Over which presumed movings of the Spirit might be disruptive. So, for example, if you read one of the sort of most famous arguments for religious liberty by a Baptist, I think he was a Baptist, I can't remember, he was a Congregationalist, but he's essentially arguing against a law that said that itinerant pastors could not just roll into someone's parish and start preaching, because that was disruptive to the establishment, essentially. Magisterial Protestantism, to speak in terms of the parable of the wheat and tares, if we were to think of what I'm talking about in terms of the wheat and tares, magisterial Protestants would let the wheat and tares grow up together. They would not try to separate them, whereas the other group I'm talking about, they're going to want to separate them. So the church is going to be wheat as much as possible, with as few tares as possible. The magisterial Protestants are not as concerned with that. Fourth, magisterial Protestants took the Old Testament seriously as the basis of a holistic political theology. While they believed that the church, capital C, was Israel now, and that Christians lived under a new covenant, they believed that the Old Testament Israel was still relevant for political and social matters. Not only might churches covenant, but polities might as well. So if you read Althusius, for example, He says this quite explicitly. And also, for example, says, even an evil commonwealth is supported and sustained by the pious. The reason is that because of their presence, it suffers less from the just wrath of God and thus avoids punishment that it deserves. In other words, Althusius is seeing things in terms of national blessing and cursing, right? Nowadays, that sort of thing would be, confined to Jerry Falwell or something. I remember, was it Katrina or something, Pat Robertson or something. I mean, nobody would even, sort of dare say anything like that. But that's how magisterial Protestants would see the nation and the events of the nation. Now, that doesn't mean you can interpret everything in those terms, but I would say now we would probably include none of it. Magisterial Protestants took the old, So not only might churches covenant, but polities might as well. Now, if you think about the Mayflower Compact, for example, that's an example of a civil covenant, or the National Covenant of the Scots. And so one of the reasons that an establishment would have, for example, laws discouraging heresy or blasphemy or violation of the Sabbath is that it could invite cursing, right? And discouraging those things could invite blessing. Now, this might also include, by the way, usury laws, sumptuary laws, welfare laws in the pursuit of a desirable national character, though this did not make the magisterial Protestants theonomists or Christian Reconstructionists. That's another conversation, but don't confuse the two in any way, shape, or form. Magisterial Protestants also desired as many Israels as possible. This meant separate magistrates managing their own national churches, if you will, though there was a great international cooperation of Reformed scholars, sometimes called the Calvinist International. I'll give you just, Althusius right out of the gate here. He says, the administration of the public functions of the realm is either ecclesiastical or secular. John Piscator says that what is just is known from the second table of the law, and ruling in fear of God is understood according to the first. Both are of concern to the magistrate. Okay? Just comes right out and says it. Right? There's no, hedging that, well, it should only be the second table of the law, it should only be, life and property, a night watchman stuff. Fifth, magisterial Protestants respected natural law as a partner with the Old and New Testaments as a basis for political and social thinking. And again, I'll give you a great example from Althusius of this. He says, this administration is imposed upon the magistrate, this is administration of the ecclesiastical, is imposed upon the magistrate by the mandate of God, as we have said, and is supported by examples of pious men and by examples from reason. Scripture, example, and reason. Okay? Puts them all together, just rolls them right out there, one sentence, right? So Moses began his magistracy with this administration, which he later confirmed by a paschal lamb. Gideon began this with the erection of an altar, and he goes on with these examples. Note, by the way, they're Old Testament examples. If you read, for example, particular Baptists in England, they would basically spiritualize all of this. All of this would have to do with the church. It would have no relevance whatsoever for the state. Okay? So natural law, which was part of the humanist tradition into which the magisterial Protestants were trained, taught that reason was capable of informing political and social thinking. See, for example, Calvin's discussion. If you read the Institutes, Calvin says you can get a lot of politics just from reason. He doesn't think that because man has fallen, he's unable to have political reason. He can still reason about politics. He can't reason about salvation, but he can reason about politics. So the magisterial Protestants were not biblicists. You can Google me and Mark Knoll, where I get ugly about that business. They were not biblicists. They were not fundamentalists. And like Aquinas, they would have a careful division of laws that were all cooperating with one another. And last, magisterial Protestants desired the perpetuation of Christendom, or the Corpus Christianum. This meant they took a generous and Catholic view of medieval theology and institutions and took seriously as a model the use of civil authority to preserve Christendom. They were not ashamed of Augustine's treatment of the Donatists, for example, or the work of Constantine or Theodosius to establish Christianity over the paganism of Rome. Now, if you saw, and I'm not on Twitter, thankfully I know people who are, so they send me this stuff, so I don't have to go roll around with that. And if you pay attention to Daryl Hart or Scott Clark, they exegete Scripture like the only thing that matters is like the first century, okay? And Constantine Theodosius, it's you know, like they're untouchable. I'll give you an example here from Althusius. He says, so Constantine undertook to judge the Arian controversy, for example. He uses that as an example. And elsewhere, he says, for this reason, even though Christians in the early church suffered the gravest persecutions, they nevertheless did not forsake or oppose a magistrate, but were known to have devoted themselves constantly to peace. So it's not as though Althusius doesn't want to talk about the first century. He just doesn't think that that's the only kind of example we have. And as I'll show later, Althusius has a principle of prudence, which is really important. Okay, so now I'll talk about the second group. The second group is the separatist gathered group. I'm calling them separatist gathered. Sometimes I'll just call them separatists, sometimes I'll just call them gathered. This is the other group. These are the not magisterial Protestants. They did not desire to ally with the magistrate, and as such, they took a dimmer view of social authority and privileged freedom and individualism more. Now, this did not make them better constitutionalists as far as I'm concerned, but there has been an argument as of late, which I think actually has some persuasive points, that in the early separatist ecclesiology, you can actually find some origins of liberalism. So if you're excited about liberalism, you should be excited about separatist ecclesiology. If you're not excited about liberalism, you should not be excited about separatist ecclesiology. Pollyhoff, for example, argues this in her analysis of Henry Jacob, who was one of the earliest separatists in England. If you read Glenn Sunshine's book, published by Canon Press here, I think that's an example of separatist ecclesiology. Okay? Sunshine has a low view of the civil magistrate. Theocracy is statism. Okay? First, the theocracy is the obvious buzzword, right? Statism is the libertarian buzzword. And the opposite of that is religious freedom. Okay? That's basically a separatist view of the civil magistrate. It's a separatist view of freedom. It's not a magisterial Protestant view of either. You also see this in Russell Moore or David French, for example. Moore is going to defend building a mosque down the street, and David French is apparently bent on immolating himself to save Drag Queen Story Hour because they privilege. I was talking to a friend of mine. He was somewhere, and anyway, I won't tell you the story. Okay, and. They privilege freedom, okay? They can't imagine anything but a wide open marketplace of ideas, okay? And that, again, I think descends from the separatist ecclesiology. So if you privilege anyone, that is like a slippery slope to the gulag, okay? If you privilege any kind of religious belief, that's a slippery slope to the gulag. What is more desirable, I think, is that among the separatists there is some emphasis on civil society. Unfortunately, this degenerates into all sorts of platitudes about things flourishing only when they're voluntary. And so for years we heard that the reason religion flourished in America was because we didn't have establishment, but the reason it died in Europe is because they had establishment. And I guess all I can say to that now is, give us another, 20 years, right? Because if you've seen sort of the latest polls on the future of Christianity in America, it's not good. Another thing that you see in the separatist ecclesiology is the argument that basically what was happening in the establishments is that people were being forced to believe things. So I want to read Althusius on this because he is well aware that this is not what is happening in the establishment. So he says, for example, he's talking about the magistrate. He is forbidden in his administration to impose a penalty over the thoughts of men. There was no presumption that this was penalizing what people thought. Heretics, so far as they are delinquent in external actions are to be punished just as any other subjects. But if the magistrate invades the imperium of God, which is the conscience, and exceeds the limits of his jurisdiction and arrogates to himself imperium over the consciences of men, he shall not do this evil with impunity. For because of this action, seditions and tumults, which persecution is wont to cause, will arise in his realm. Now, I would really encourage you to read this chapter on ecclesiastical administration, because you're going to have a hard time getting your head around it. Because what he's going to say at the same time is the magistrate has authority, he is not to tread on the conscience. And we've all been trained to think, well, that's exactly what establishment is. And Althusius says, no, it's not. Okay, who were the separatist gathered Protestants? Well, the first group was the Anabaptists, who desired to separate really from society, but especially from the magisterial Protestants, from the established churches. They also did not think that Christians should hold political office, or serve in the military. And of course, for the magisterial Protestants, as if all this was not enough, they were going to rebaptize people, which basically meant you had to discern whether or not they were Christians, bring them into your fellowship, and everybody else was left outside, basically, of Christian fellowship, right? That's kind of the antithesis of what I described with the magisterial Protestants. You can read about the Anabaptists in their own confession, the Schleitheim Confession of 1527. I encourage you to Google it. Not now. The closest thing to Anabaptists today would be the Amish, certain sects of the Brethren and Mennonites, but there are like 31 flavors. And so, don't think that your Mennonite friend or whatever, is, or your Amish friend, so tread lightly. Magisterial Protestants really hated the Anabaptists for lots of important reasons. And one comes to understand Zwingli and Luther by reading them in light of both the Anabaptists and the Roman Catholics. Okay? You will not understand Luther or Zwingli if you don't read them against the background of the Anabaptists, if you just read them against the background of the Roman Catholics. Now, Baptists, and I didn't jump to Baptists because Baptists came from Anabaptists. Baptists were basically Congregationalists who stopped baptizing babies. That's basically what Baptists were, okay? They were willing to fight or hold office, but their unwillingness to baptize babies made them look like Anabaptists. So if you read their Congregationalist opponents, they'll basically just call Baptists Anabaptists, and they just couldn't care less whether they're not the same thing or not. It's not very nice. Congregationalists are complicated. The earliest Congregationalists were persecuted. Some of them were executed because what they basically did was separate from the Church of England. Now, they tried to say, they tried to have variations on this. You can go and hear preaching in a Church of England, but you can't take the sacraments, or things like that. And that was basically considered seditious because it was contrary to the establishment. Their argument was that actually the bishops had usurped the authority of the magistrate, of the queen. That was their way of kind of getting out of that. There's a joke, why are Anglicans bad chess players? Because they can't tell the difference between a bishop and a queen. Now that works in two ways. And you can figure out the lower way of getting a chuckle out of that. But the higher way is that the Congregationalists tried to say, no, actually, we respect the magistrate, we just don't respect his bishops. In other words, we don't respect his established church, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, like I said, that sort of gets complicated. And John Cotton, if you read his debate with Williams, he is one of the most sort of popular advocates for establishment, even though he's a Congregationalist. What basically happened was the Congregationalists resisted the establishment in England and then came over to America and set up their own establishments. Now, if you read my book, which I'm sorry Jeff didn't bring, but it has a really cool cover with Zwingli's helmet and sword on it. It's worth getting just for that alone. I say in there that the Congregationalists had all kinds of theological, ecclesiastical problems which made the establishment impossible. And Williams gets to dunk on Cotton a lot because he's really kind of a half-hearted separatist. So what the separatists wanted to do was separate from the established church, Then you figure out who all the Christians are, and then you gather them into your fellowship. Now, obviously, where does that leave everybody else? Outside the church, right? Roger Williams actually coined a phrase that kind of sounds like Jefferson's, which he coined in letters to Baptists, by the way, in which he talked about the church being a garden which was walled off from the world. So you had to wall off the garden of the church from the world. Obviously, to discern people's conversion, it was nice to have a conversion story. So if you think about, say, if you've ever read, who's read the diary of David Brainerd, the Jonathan Edwards? Yeah, I mean, don't give that to new Christians because they're going to wonder where their David Brainerd conversion is, right? And then when you go sit before the session, for example, in a Presbyterian church, which is basically a Baptist church, and you have to give your conversion story, you're going to want to give a David Brainerd conversion story, right? Even Pilgrim's Progress is arguably, written by a Baptist, arguably a conversion narrative, right? And so the conversion narrative privileges the work of the Spirit, particularly in the context of divine sovereignty. So you're separating the wheat and the tares. Now, here's something kind of interesting about this. Now, and this actually makes me very sympathetic to the Separatists and the gathered Protestants. They're very worried about hypocrisy, and I appreciate that. And they're worried not only about the soul of the hypocrite, but they're also worried about false religion being, stinky, right? Which Scripture says it is. Now, what's funny, though, is that Williams, who makes both of these arguments, by the way, who was cited in another Supreme Court case, this one on school prayer, they cite Williams. What they failed to cite was that the reason Williams would have opposed children praying in schools was that it was stench in God's nostrils. I don't think that's actually what they were thinking when they made the legal reasoning, right? But they readily deploy Williams, but they want nothing to do with his reasoning. Fourth, I don't think also, by the way, that any Supreme Court justices thought that the Church of England was the whore of Babylon. I don't think that was part of their jurisprudence either. The Separatist gathered Protestants tended to spiritualize the Old Testament and exclude it as political theology. And again, I've already made some reference to that. Now, what's curious, though, if you read people who are basically Separatist gathered Protestants, and I'll number David Van Drunen among them, the Old Testament's great for talking about being being exiles in Babylon and stuff like that. But otherwise, the whole business of Israel is just, it's just the church, and it has no application for civil society. So there's actually a little bit of picking and choosing there. Now, the funny thing about Separatist gathered Protestants is that they actually have to take kind of a higher view of natural law than Magisterial Protestants. So as I read to you in Althusius, he's able to talk about scripture, reason, and example. If you read like Miller, some of Miller's tweets, who wrote The Religion of Christian Nationalism, he has to take a very high view of civil law, of natural law, and so does David Van Drunen. Because you can't use scripture, you can't do political theology. So you got to have something, and you have natural law. And what's interesting about that is if you read Roger Williams basically says, if you look at the Indians, they have all the elements of a good civil society, and they're at least as good as ours or better, right? Because they have reason. And in a way, you say, well, okay, I get that. But in another way, you say, well, if somebody handed them a Bible, could they do a little better? Could they do a little? I'd like to think they could. It's an interesting question, right? The answer is yes, but it's an interesting question for people who don't think in those terms. And then last, Separatist gathered Protestants value martyrdom over Christendom. And I talked a little bit about that already, that idea of looking at Scripture only through the lens of the early church. Another example of this, by the way, is Romans 13. I have an essay on resistance and revolution. You can go find it on the web. It's actually in a book that Davenant just published on Protestant social thought, Protestant social. Anyway, it's really good. And a lot of that was excerpted. And I talk a little bit about Romans 13 in there, but what's interesting is when you read people who say, well, Romans 13 was written while the church was being persecuted, so basically what it teaches is unlimited obedience. And nobody does that. I mean, nobody no Protestant really does that. A few Anglicans do it, but they're fighting over the Glorious Revolution or something like that. But basically, nobody's doing that. That's a really kind of bizarre historical thing. Well, okay, those are my two categories. I'm going to leave it there. And Jeff didn't bring me all this way to draw all the conclusions. So now it's time for Q&A.